Lecture 4, Opinions about the Material Cause. It is evident, then, that one must acquire scientific knowledge of those causes which stand at the beginning, for we say that we have scientific knowledge of each thing when we think we comprehend its first cause. Now, causes are spoken of in four ways. Of these we say that one is the substance or quiddity of a thing, for the first why of a thing is reduced to its ultimate intelligible structure, and the first why of a thing is a cause or principle, another is the matter or subject, a third is the source of motion, a fourth is the cause which is opposite to this, namely that for the sake of which or the good, for this is the goal of every generation and motion. There has been sufficient consideration of these in our works on nature. However, let us examine those who have undertaken an investigation of existing things and have philosophized about the truth before us. For evidently they too speak of certain principles and causes, therefore to us who come later their views will serve as an introduction to the study which we are now making, for we shall either discover some other genus of cause, or be more convinced of those which have just been expounded. Most of those who first philosophized thought that only the things that belong to the species of matter are the principles of all things, for that of which all things are composed, from which they first come to be, and into which they are finally dissolved, while their substance remains, although it is changed in its attributes. This they call the element and principle of existing things. And for this reason they thought that nothing is either generated or corrupted, as if such a reality always remained in existence. And just as we do not say that Socrates comes to be in an unqualified sense when he becomes good or musical, or is corrupted when he loses these states, because the subject Socrates himself remains, in the same way they say that nothing else is generated or corrupted, for there must be some matter, either one or more than one, from which other things come to be, and which itself remains in existence. However, they do not all speak in the same way about the number and nature of such a principle. Thales, the originator of this kind of philosophy, says that this principle is water. This is why he also claimed that the earth rests upon water. For presumably he took this position because he saw that the nutriment of all things is moist, that heat itself is generated from this, and that animal life comes from this, but that from which each thing comes to be is a principle of all things. He bases his opinion on this then, and on the fact that the seeds of all things have a moist nature, and water is by nature the principle of moist things. But there are some who think that the ancients who lived long before the present generation and were the first to speculate about the gods held this view about the nature of things, for they made Oceanus and Thetis the parents of generation, and held to the oath of the gods to be by a body of water, to which the poets gave the name Styx. For what is oldest is most honorable, and what is most honorable is that by which one swears. Whether this view of nature is in fact the ancient and primary one is perhaps uncertain. Thales is said to have expressed himself in this way about the first cause, but no one could say that Hippo is to be included in this group, because of the weakness of his understanding. Anaximenes and Diogenes hold that air is prior to water and is the most fundamental of the simple bodies. Hippasus of Metopontium and Heraclitus of Ephesus hold that fire is the primary principle. Empedocles holds that there are four simple bodies, since he adds a fourth, earth, to those already mentioned, for he says that these always remain and only become many or few in number, by being combined into a unity and separated out of a unity. Anaxagoras of Clazomene, who was prior to Empedocles in years, but later in his speculations, says that the principles of things are infinite in number, for he says that nearly all bodies which are made up of parts like themselves, such as fire or water, are generated or corrupted merely by combining and separating, but that otherwise they are neither generated nor corrupted, but always remain in existence. From these views, then, one might think that the only cause is the one which is said to belong to the species of matter. Having set forth a preface in which he indicates the aim of this science, its dignity and goal, Aristotle begins to deal with this science, and this is divided into two parts. In the first, he explains what the first philosophers had to say about the causes of things. In the second, he begins to pursue the truth of this science. He does this in Book 2 at Theoretical or Speculative Knowledge. The first part is divided into two members. First, he gives the opinions of the philosophers about the causes of things. Second, he criticizes them insofar as their statements are unsatisfactory, at therefore all those. In regard to the first, he does two things. First, he takes up again the enumeration of causes, which was treated in greater detail in Physics, Book 2. Second, he presents the opinions of the philosophers at, however, let us examine the four causes and three characteristics of final cause. Accordingly, he first says that since it is evident that wisdom speculates about causes, we ought to begin by acquiring knowledge from the causes of things. This also seems to be in keeping with the intelligible structure of science, because we say that we know each thing scientifically when we think we are not ignorant of its cause. Now, causes are spoken of in four ways. One of these is the formal cause, which is the very substance of a thing by which we know what each thing is. For it is well known, as is stated in Physics Book 2, that we do not say that anything has a nature before it has received a form. Now it is clear that a form is a cause, because to answer the question, why is something so, we go back to its formal cause as its ultimate explanation, beginning with proximate forms and proceeding to the ultimate form. But evidently the why asks about a cause and principle, hence it is evident that a form is a cause. A second cause is the material cause. A third is the efficient cause, which is the source of motion. A fourth is the final cause, which is opposite to the efficient cause, as a goal is to the starting point. For motion begins with the efficient cause and terminates with the final cause. This cause is also that for the sake of which a thing comes to be, and the good of each nature. He makes the final cause thus known by three considerations. It is the goal of motion, and thus it is opposite to the source of motion, which is the efficient cause. It is the first in intention, and for this reason is said to be that for the sake of which. And it is desirable of itself, and for this reason is called a good, for the good is that what all desire. Hence, in explaining how the final cause is opposite to the efficient cause, he says that it is the end of every process of generation and motion, whose starting point is the efficient cause. By these two types of change, he seems to imply that there is a twofold goal. For the goal of a process of generation is the form itself, which is a part of a thing, but the goal of motion is something sought for outside the thing moved. He says that he has treated these causes at sufficient length in the Physics, lest he should be asked to make a more extensive treatment of them. However, let us examine. Here he states what the philosophers had to say about the causes, and in regard to this he does two things. First, he gives the reason why this must be done, and second, he begins to carry out his plan at most of those. Accordingly, he says that even though there is a treatise on the causes in the Physics, it is still necessary to consider the opinions of the philosophers who first undertook an investigation of the natures of existing things, and have philosophized about the truth before him, because they too set down causes and principles. Therefore, for us who have come later, a consideration of their opinions will be first, or a preamble in the study, that is, to the art which we are now seeking. Hence the text of Boethius also says, therefore, as we enter upon the task of this science, their opinions will constitute a preamble to the road that is now to be traveled. Another text has, therefore, as we enter upon our present course, it will be a certain work of life in the investigation that now confronts us. And it must be read in this way, therefore, as we enter upon our present course, that is, upon the present study in art, it will be necessary to consider the opinion of these men as a work of life, that is to say, as necessary, like works which are done for the preservation of life, so that this reading is interpreted as a metaphorical way of speaking, meaning by work of life anything necessary. Now this is useful, because from the opinions of those men we will either discover another genus of causes over and above those already enumerated, or be convinced of the things that have just been stated about the causes, namely that there are four of them, most of those. Here he begins to deal with the opinions of the ancient philosophers. In regard to this, he does two things. First, he states their opinions. Second, he finds fault with them, and therefore all those. In regard to the first, he does two things. First, he states the opinions which each of the philosophers held about the causes. Second, he summarizes the discussion that we have examined. The first part is divided into two parts. In the first, he gives the opinions of those who omitted the formal cause. In the second, he gives the opinion of Plato, who is the first to posit a formal cause after the philosophies. In regard to the first, he does two things. First, he gives the opinion of those who claimed that certain evident things are principles. Second, he gives the opinion of those who devised extrinsic principles, at Leucippus and his colleague. In regard to this, he does two things. First, he touches on the opinions which the ancient philosophers held about the material cause. Second, on their opinions about the efficient cause, but as men. In regard to the first, he does two things. First, he states in a general way the views of those who posited a material cause. Second, he examines their views in detail at Thales, the originator. In regard to the first, he does two things. First, he states their opinion about the material cause. Second, he states their opinion about the generation of things which follow from the first, at and for this reason. Opinions of those who gave only material cause for characteristics of matter. Accordingly, he says first that most of those who first philosophized about the natural world held that the principles of all things were merely those which are referred to the species of material cause. In regard to this, it must be said that they took the four conditions of matter which seems to belong to the notion of a principle. For that of which a thing is composed seems to be a principle of that thing, but matter is such a thing, for we say that a thing that has matter is of itself, as a knife is of iron. That from which a thing comes to be, which is also a principle of the process of generation of that thing, seems to be one of its causes, because a thing comes into being by way of generation, but a thing first comes to be from matter, because the matter of things precedes their production, and a thing does not come in from matter in an accidental way, for a thing is generated in an accidental way from its contrary or privation, as well as we say that white comes from black. Third, that into which all things are ultimately dissolved by corruption seems to be a principle of things. For just as principle are first in the process of generation, in a similar way they are last in the process of dissolution. Probably this too pertains to matter. Fourth, since a principle must remain in existence, then that which remains throughout the process of generation and corruption seems to be a principle. Now the matter which they said is the substance of a thing remains throughout every transmutation, although its attributes, such as its form, and everything that accrues to it over and above its material substance, are changed. For all these considerations they concluded that matter is the element and the principle of all beings. No generation of corruption without a material cause, and for this reason. Then he gives as a secondary point what they held as following from the above, namely, that in the world nothing is generated or corrupted in an absolute sense. For when some change occurs with regard to a thing's attributes and its substance remains unchanged, we do not say that it's generated or corrupted in an absolute sense, but only in a qualified one. For example, when Socrates becomes good or musical, we do not say that he simply comes to be, but comes to be this. And similarly, when he loses a state of this kind, we do not say that he is corrupted in an absolute sense, but only in a qualified one. But matter, which is the substance of things according to them, always remains, and every charge affects some of a thing's accidents, such as its attributes. From this they concluded that nothing is generated or corrupted in an absolute sense, but only in a qualified one. Yet even though they all agreed in positing a material cause, nevertheless they differed in their position in two respects. First, with respect to the number of material causes, because some held that there is one, and others held that others many, saying with respect to its nature, because some held that it is fire, others water, and so on. Similarly, among those who posited many material causes, some assigned certain ones as the material principles of things, and some the others. Thales, the originator. Here he begins to give the questions of each of the philosophers about the material cause. First, he gives the opinion of those who posited one material cause. Second, the opinions of those who posited many at Empedocles. In regard to the first, he does three things. First, he gives the opinion of those who claimed that water is the principle of all things. Second, he gives the opinion of those who made air the principle of things at Anaximenes. And third, the principle of those who claimed that fire is the principle of things at Hippasus. In regard to the first, he does two things. First, he gives the opinion of Thales, who said that water is the principle of things. Second, the reason for this opinion, for presumably he says then that Thales, the originator of this kind of philosophy, speculative philosophy, said that water is the first principle of all things. Thales is said to have been the originator of speculative philosophy because he was the only one of the 7 wise men who came after the theological poets to make an investigation into the causes of things. The other sages being concerned with moral matters. The names of the 7 wise men are as follows. The first was Thales of Miletus, who lived during the reign of Romulus, and when Ahaz, king of Israel, was reigning over Judea. The second was Pittacus of Mytilene, who lived when Sedecius was reigning over the Hebrews, and when Tarquinius Priscus was reigning over the Romans. The other 5 sages were Solomon of Athens, Chilo of Lacedaemon, Periander of Corinth, Cleobulus of Lydia, and Bias of Prience, all of whom lived during that period of the Babylonian captivity. Hence, since Thales alone among these men investigated the natures of things and distinguished himself by committing his arguments to writing, he is declared here as an originator of his science. Now, not should it be thought unfitting if he touches here on the opinions of those who have treated only the philosophy of nature, because according to the ancients who held no one substance except the body and mobile, it was necessary that first philosophy be the philosophy of nature, as is stated in Book 4, and from this position Thales next adopted this me, but that the earth may rest upon water, as everything having a proper principle is based on its principle. For presumably here he gives the reasons by which Thales could be led to that above position. For first, he shows how he was led to this station by his own reasoning, and second, by the authority of the predecessors. At first there are some. Now he was led by 2 lines of reasoning. One is taken from the cause itself of a thing, the other is taken from a consideration of the generation of things, and on the fact. Therefore, generating these premiers are related. The second follows first from the first, because the first, which is a special or which is a principle of being of the thing, is also the final purpose of which things are generated. The third follows from the wind. Second, because by corruption each thing is dissolved into that which from it was generated. The fourth follows from the second and third, lest for that which precedes the generation of a image all things and remain a generation of things and remain after they have been corrupted must always remain in being